The streetlights flickered against the polished chrome of the 1965 Lincoln Continental. It sat idling, double-parked, a black shark in a sea of gray pavement. Rain had begun to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the streets of Harlem and sent the late-night revelers scurrying for cover under the awnings of the local bodegas. But the car didn't move. It just hummed, a low mechanical growl that vibrated against the wet asphalt. Inside the vehicle, the leather seats were empty. The engine was running. The driver's side door was unlatched, clicking rhythmically against the frame with every gust of wind. Two beat cops patrolling the graveyard shift approached cautiously. Flashlights cut through the gloom. They recognized the car immediately. Everyone in Harlem knew that car. It belonged to the inner circle. It was a chariot of the gods, or rather, the devils who ran the uptown numbers racket. One officer popped the trunk. The smell hit them before the light did. Metallic, copper, and the distinct cloying scent of cheap cologne mixed with terror. Inside, curled into a fetal position, was Eddie Silk Baker. He was Bumpy Johnson's personal driver. Stuffed into his mouth was a crumpled, blood-stained map of Harlem, and scattered across his lifeless chest were 80% $1,000 bills. $80,000. The price of betrayal. The message wasn't just for the police. It wasn't just for the neighborhood. It was for the men downtown who thought they could buy Harlem's secrets. The king was home from Alcatraz, and the throne was not for sale. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not merely a gangster. He was a frantic, brilliant anomaly in the American underworld. By 1966, he had returned from a brutal decade-long stint at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The world he returned to had changed. The Harlem of the Jazz Age was fading, replaced by the harder, sharper edges of the Civil Rights era and the rising tide of the heroin epidemic. But Bumpy remained the professor. He was a man who read Nietzsche and history books, a chess master who treated the streets like a 64-square board. He didn't just run the numbers racket, he was the gatekeeper of Harlem. No heroin moved, no dice rolled, and no Italian mobster operated above 110th Street without Bumpy taking his cut. The atmosphere in Harlem during the autumn of 1966 was thick with tension. The Genovese crime family, longtime partners of Bumpy, were growing restless. The older dons respected the treaty, but a younger generation of mafiosos saw Harlem not as a partnership, but as a territory to be conquered. They saw the money flowing through the veins of the neighborhood, millions of dollars in small bills, and they wanted to cut out the middleman. They wanted Bumpy gone. But you don't just kill Bumpy Johnson. He was protected by a phalanx of loyal soldiers, and more importantly, by the community itself. He paid mortgages, bought turkeys for Thanksgiving, and settled disputes the police wouldn't touch. To get to Bumpy, you needed a map. Not a geographical map. Anyone could buy a Rand McNally guide, but a route map. This document was the holy grail of the Harlem underworld. It detailed the precise times and locations of the cash drops. It listed the safe houses where the bank was counted. It named the corrupt police captains on the payroll. It was the blueprint of the entire organization. Possessing this map meant you could dismantle Bumpy's empire in a single night of coordinated raids and hijacks. It was the only vulnerability in an otherwise ironclad system. And the only people who knew the full rotation were Bumpy himself, and the man who drove the car, Eddie Silk Baker. The threat came from downtown, wearing a $3,000 suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His name was Lorenzo the Hammer Scarpelli. Scarpelli was a capo in the Genovese family, a man whose ambition far exceeded his patience. He was known in Little Italy not for his negotiation skills, but for his affinity for masonry hammers, hence the nickname. He had recently taken over the Pleasant Avenue distribution ring and was looking to make a name that would ring out all the way to Sicily. He viewed Bumpy Johnson not as a legend, but as an aging relic, an obstacle standing between him and absolute control of the heroin trade in Upper Manhattan. Lorenzo didn't want a war. Wars were expensive and drew FBI attention. He wanted a coup. He was ruthless, efficient, and flush with cash from the booming narcotics trade. Scarpelli had done his homework. He knew that Bumpy was insulated, paranoid, and brilliant. A direct hit was suicide. Bumpy's bodyguards, men like Junie Bird, were sharpshooters who didn't miss. Scarpelli needed an inside man. He needed someone close enough to see the papers, but weak enough to be bought. He set his sights on Eddie Baker. Eddie was young, flashy, and addicted to the high life. He wore sharkskin suits he couldn't afford and gambled on horses that always lost. He was a man drowning in debt, looking for a lifeline. Scarpelli offered him one. The meeting took place in the back of a smoky club in Greenwich Village. Scarpelli slid a leather satchel across the table. Inside was $80,000 in cash. In 1966, that was enough to buy 3 houses, a fleet of cars, and a new life in California. All Eddie had to do was hand over the route map for the October collections, the biggest haul of the year. "One piece of paper, Eddie," Scarpelli had whispered, the smoke from his cigar curling around them like a snake. "And you live like a king." The air inside Small's paradise was heavy, perfumed with the scent of fried chicken, expensive scotch, and the nervous sweat of dangerous men. The legendary club was packed. On stage, a jazz quartet played a frantic, discordant bebop tune that seemed to mirror the tension in the room. Waiters, in crisp white jackets, weaved through the tables, their trays held high, eyes averted from the corner booth where the fate of Harlem was being decided. Bumpy Johnson sat in the center of the booth facing the door. He wore a charcoal gray suit, immaculate, his face a mask of stone. Flanking him were 2 of his most trusted lieutenants. Across the table sat Lorenzo Scarpelli, flanked by 3 of his own soldiers. The time was Scarpelli looked comfortable, almost bored. He swirled his drink, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. He believed he held the winning hand. He believed he had the map. In his mind, his crews were already moving into position, ready to intercept Bumpy's cash drops at midnight. "You're looking tired, Ellsworth," Scarpelli said, using Bumpy's given name with a deliberate lack of respect. "Maybe the retirement life is calling you. Florida is nice this time of year." Bumpy didn't blink. He took a slow drag from his cigarette. "I prefer the cold, Lorenzo. It keeps the mind sharp." The waiter placed a fresh round of drinks on the table. The clatter of glass on wood sounded like gunshots in the sudden lull of conversation. The band had stopped playing. The room seemed to sense the violence coiling in that booth. "Sharpness is good," Scarpelli grinned, leaning forward, "but information is better. You know, things change fast in this city. Routes change. Alliances change. Sometimes even the people driving the car change." It was a direct taunt, a signal that he knew. Bumpy remained motionless. His eyes, dark and impenetrable, bored into Scarpelli. A man who relies on the loyalty of thieves is building his house on sand. Scarpelli checked his gold Rolex. He was waiting for the phone call. The call that would confirm his men had intercepted the first shipment based on Eddie's map. He tapped his fingers on the table. 1, 2, 3. "I'm offering you a graceful exit, Bumpy," Scarpelli said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Surrender the territory north of 110th. Take a percentage. Live out your days. Or tonight, everything burns." The tension stretched, thin and brittle as spun glass. A bead of sweat rolled down the temple of one of Scarpelli's bodyguards. Bumpy's men hadn't moved a muscle. They were statues carved from granite. The phone at the maitre d's station rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence of the club. The maitre d' picked it up, listened for a second, and then walked over to the booth. He carried the phone on a long extension cord. He placed it gently in front of Scarpelli. Scarpelli smiled. The victory lap. He picked up the receiver. "Yeah?" The color drained from his face instantly. It went from arrogant flush to cadaverous white in the span of a heartbeat. He listened for 10 seconds. His hand began to shake. He slammed the receiver down, staring at Bumpy with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The room held its breath. The silence was deafening. What Scarpelli didn't know What he couldn't have known was that Bumpy Johnson played chess while others played checkers. Bumpy had known about Eddie Silk Baker for 2 weeks. He hadn't needed a wiretap. He hadn't needed a torture session. He had seen it in the new gold lighter Eddie used. He heard it in the slight tremor in Eddie's voice when he asked about the schedule. Bumpy had watched Eddie the way a hawk watches a field mouse. Bumpy had sat Eddie down in the back of the Lenox lounge. He hadn't accused him. Instead, he had given him the route map. He had personally handed Eddie the envelope, telling him these were the new, highly confidential collection points for October. But the map was a fiction. It was a masterpiece of disinformation. The locations listed on that map weren't collection points. They were decoys, abandoned warehouses, empty lots. And in 3 specific cases, they were the exact locations of ongoing NYPD stakeouts that Bumpy had anonymously tipped off hours earlier. When Scarpelli's men hit those locations at midnight, they didn't find cash. They found a battalion of New York's finest waiting for them. Back in the booth at Small's Paradise, Bumpy finally moved. He reached into his jacket pocket. Scarpelli's guards flinched, hands diving for their waistbands. But Bumpy didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a set of car keys. He slid them across the tablecloth. They stopped right at the edge of Scarpelli's drink. They were the keys to the Lincoln Continental. "You paid 80 grand for a map, Lorenzo," Bumpy said, his voice low, gravelly, and terrifyingly calm. "But you forgot to ask who drew it." Scarpelli stared at the keys. "The money is yours," Bumpy continued. "I let Eddie keep it. He's going to need it where he's going. But since you paid for the ride, you should check the trunk. I think your investment is inside." Scarpelli looked at the phone, then at the keys, then at the old man sitting across from him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His men were being arrested across the city. His money was gone. And the man he bribed was dead. "You think you can buy Harlem?" Bumpy stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Harlem isn't for sale, and neither are my men the ones that are—" "They expire quickly." Scarpelli bolted from Small's Paradise, his entourage scrambling to keep up. They found the Lincoln Continental parked 3 blocks away, exactly where Bumpy said it would be. When they opened the trunk and found Eddie Baker, Scarpelli vomited in the gutter. The $80,000 scattered over the body was a final insult. It was Bumpy saying that Scarpelli's money was trash. It was blood money that had purchased nothing but death. Scarpelli couldn't touch the cash. It was evidence now. He couldn't move the body. He had to run. By the next morning, the ripple effects tore through the underworld. The Genovese family, embarrassed by the botched raids and the arrests of high-ranking soldiers, summoned Scarpelli to a sit-down from which he never returned. The Harlem tax remained in place. The message resonated through the streets of Harlem like a church bell. The young hustlers, the up-and-coming dealers who had whispered that the old man was losing his touch, fell silent. They realized that Bumpy wasn't just surviving, he was orchestrating. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Small's Paradise that night and stopped on the sidewalk of 135th Street. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating a face that had seen decades of war. He didn't smile. There was no joy in killing a man you once trusted, but there was order. And in Bumpy's world, order was everything. He remained the undisputed king of Harlem. His territory expanded, his legend grew, and for the remainder of his life, no one ever tried to buy one of his drivers again. This gruesome night in 1966 serves as a definitive chapter in the legend of Bumpy Johnson. It illustrates why he survived in a game where the average lifespan was measured in months, not decades. While other gangsters relied solely on brute force, the hammer approach of men like Scarpelli, Bumpy utilized superior intelligence. He understood that information was the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal. The route map incident reveals the core of Bumpy's philosophy. Instead of killing Eddie immediately, Bumpy used him as a weapon against a greater threat. He turned a liability into a checkmate. There is a timeless lesson here. one that transcends the gritty streets of 1960s Harlem. Real power isn't about how loud you can shout or how hard you can hit. It's about seeing 3 moves ahead. It's about understanding your opponent's greed and using it against them.